I'm going to begin with an apology as well. I'm not an expert in visual humor or Thomas Nast. In fact, I'm a little embarrassed to be presenting on visual humor, given that Chris Gilbert's in the audience. He's a real expert. So any questions I can ask, he probably can. I'm going to, I'm borrowing Jennifer Greenhill's observation as the premise of my presentation today. Her illuminating study points to a tension in American culture during a period when the widening gap between the rich and the poor first gained public attention. Greenhill notes that in this period, philanthropic elites expended substantial sums of money on collecting art and building monuments, libraries, and museums that would edify the American public, while at the same time, the everyday experience of middle-class Americans was suffused with a jocularity quite indifferent to the seriousness of the culture promoted by the elite. In other words, the social division was not simply a matter of who had and who had not, but rather that the elite's reverence for high culture was at odds with the hoi polloi's rough and tumble comic sensibility, in which all was fair game for derision, especially the pretensions of the elite. Now, it's often remarked that Thomas Nast was the father of the American political cartoon. In this presentation, I hope to show that this deserved status was due to a confluence of factors. I argue that Nast's cartoons harnessed the energy of this tension between artistic sophistication and popular humor, a result of having begun his career as an illustrator, not a cartoonist. After formal training initiated, I should have moved on, yeah. After formal training initiated when he was only 13 years old, first under Theodore Kaufman, a master of historical painting, and later at the Academy of Design, he was hired as an illustrator at Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper in 1856, while still only 15. Leslie's was one of the first publications in a new form of illustrated journalism. During 2 years on the staff at Leslie's, Nast depicted scenes of contemporary life. However, the paper struggled under mismanagement, and Nast left to work as a freelancer before joining the staff at New York Illustrated in November of 1859. Most notable among his assignments for this paper was the execution and burial of John Brown, only a month after New York Illustrated started operations. And in 1860, Nast was dispatched to Europe, where he embedded with Garibaldi's army during the campaign to unify Italy. Nast's illustrations of these momentous events called on his training in historical art. We see evidence of his conventional skill in this image of Garibaldi's victorious arrival in Naples. It's a straightforward illustration of an important moment depicted uncritically, even honorifically, consisting with his training in historical painting. By the time Nast returned to the US in late 1860, the nation was on the brink of civil war. And in 1862, Harper's Illustrated Weekly recruited him to document the national crisis. Over the course of the war, Nast's Republican Unionist sympathies are expressed in the images he published in Harper's. The picture War in the Border States uses a diptych of two tondi, those are encircled images, saturated in sentimentalism. In the left-hand image, we see a wife's distress at the mustering of her husband in the winter, paired with the right-hand image of the grieving family over the death of the husband and father. Other details, perhaps not easy to make out in this slide, include the inset lower tondo with a skull and rib cage of a presumably fallen soldier near what looks to be an abandoned farm. And then in the outer frame, we can see an artillery battery destroying a bridge on the lower right, and other scenes, such as a group hiding from marauders in the upper left, and in the opposite corner, what appears to be rustlers stealing livestock. And in a blasted landscape titled The Results of War, Virginia, 1863, Nast turns the conventions of American landscape painting on their head as war has ravaged the once pastoral countryside. We see an obliterated bridge in Riverside Mill, the natural setting devastated, and not a human figure anywhere. Clearly, these pictures express a somber acknowledgement of the destruction of war and with no hint of humor or satire. Although cartoonists caricatured Abraham Lincoln, Nast's images of him are consistent with his earlier illustrations as well as his politics. This 1861 portrait of Lincoln in the New York Illustrated depicts the president with conventional respect. Nast maintains that reverence for Lincoln in later images. Here on the left, titled, here in this one, there used to be two images on this slide, I deleted one. A Union Christmas Dinner from 1864 features an elliptical focal point framed in seasonal holly, depicting Lincoln as the host of a great feast. In the tonde at the lower corners are images of Confederate surrender, and at the bottom center, we see a Union celebration of victory, while in the upper corners are classically styled images of atonement or comfort. This is a strong example of the complexity of Nast's composition, and note still no satire. Now, an early taste of Nast's critical cartooning can be seen in an image from 1864 titled Compromise with the South, in which Nast condemns the Democratic Party's platform of capitulation to the South. Here, the bowed figures, the man, an amputee, likely a wounded veteran, the other, the classical image of Columbia representing the nation, mourn over the grave of Union heroes who died, as it says on the gravesite, in a useless war, are in sharp contrast with the arrogant Confederate opponent who perches his foot disrespectfully atop the mounded grave. If we had any doubt that Nast rejects any concession to the Confederacy, the tattered U.S. flag flown upside down, the universal distress signal in the upper left corner, opposite the waving Confederate flag on the right, should be clear. The background imagery of a burning cross on the left and a huddled couple on the right, one with shackles indicating enslavement, and the other who appears to be a native woman with a papoose, suggests the terror that will follow should the North concede to the South. To ensure the correct interpretation, the Harper's editorial in the same issue called explicit attention to Nast's illustration with the blunt warning, quote, "When compromise shall come, the consequence to the North will be the total prostration represented by Nast's picture. For compromise with armed rebellion is abject submission," unquote. As the war gave way to Reconstruction and evolved into the Gilded Age, Nast's artwork consistently takes on the satirical character for which he's most often remembered. For example, having become disillusioned with Andrew Johnson for pardoning Confederate rebels and rescinding his earlier support for black suffrage, Nast depicts him in the role of the betrayer Iago to the black soldier's Othello. And the texts in the two lower corners are a page from Shakespeare's play on the left and a corresponding page of a Johnson speech on the right, reinforcing the theme of betrayal common to both. This explicit allusion to Shakespeare is one of many that Nast will deploy, indicating his nod to cultural sophistication. And although Lawrence Levine's highbrow, lowbrow makes the point that Shakespeare was popular in entertainment in this era, Nast's reliance on detail, composite imagery, and textual inclusion provides a complex context that reaches beyond caricature. Now, to be sure, caricature is an important technique to Nast, and especially because it aims for the popular jocularity that Greenhill notes as one pole in the dichotomy of American culture. In images like this, Nast is straddling that divide between the elites and the masses, and sparing no feelings of the powerful whose actions he holds in contempt. The double-page cartoon titled Amphitheatrum Johnsonianum evokes classical history to suggest a parallel between Johnson and a Roman emperor. The enthroned Johnson, observing the gladiator spectacle, is surrounded by a self-serving cast that includes Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles in front, the guy with the beard, and Secretary of State Seward whispering in Johnson's ear. The caricatures here are clear, but as in the Othello cartoon, the classical allusion bridges the divide between the elite reverence for antiquity and the popular disdain for government indifference to humanitarian principle. And this last one of Johnson again evokes Shakespeare. This time Johnson intones the most quoted line from the climax of Richard III, suggesting the desperation of a treacherous leader. The exaggeration of caricature in this particular one is more pronounced as Nast's ridicule of Johnson increases in intensity. Sustained caricature is front and center in Nast's long-running series of satirical cartoons highlighting the corruption of Tammany Hall power brokers, particularly William M. Boss Tweed. Tammany Hall, first established in the late 18th century, was a New York political arm of the Democratic Party. During the Gilded Age, Tammany gained considerable influence under Tweed's leadership, often with underhanded leverage over politicians such as New York City Mayor and later Governor John T. Hoffman. Other Tweed's associates found themselves in key positions, including Comptroller and Commissioner of Public Works of New York City, that enabled Tammany to control the city's and the state's management and coffers. Kenneth Ackerman has noted it's hard not to admire the skill behind Tweed's system. The Tweed ring at its height was an engineering marvel, strong and solid, strategically deployed to control key power points, the courts, the legislature, the treasury, and the ballot box. Its frauds had a grandeur of scale and an elegance of structure, money laundering, profit sharing, and organization. Through bribery, extortion, embezzlement, and insider trading, Tweed and his ring gained extensive power. This chicanery attracted the attention of New York Times reporters, and Nast cartoons that took on the Tammany ring are often credited with bringing about Tweed's fall from power. Nast's images of Tweed relied heavily on caricature as well as some of his other stock pictorial strategies, such as in this image. Here, the State House in Albany under Tammany control is portrayed as a Vatican court, decorated with decrees from Pius Hoffman, the Pope/governor presiding. And though Hoffman sits on the throne in this court, we see Cardinal Tweed, that would be him here, Cardinal Tweed at the right, closest to the crates of public cash. Just a few years prior, Tammany had courted the support of the Irish Catholic population for votes to the Democratic Party. And the Tammany alliance with Catholics afforded Nast, a Republican and a Protestant, an opportunity to allude to the popular notion of Roman Catholic corruption, which this Vatican imagery clearly signals. Similarly, this courtly image depicts Tweed as the power behind the throne. That's the one on the left. And we see the Tammany boss holding a sword labeled power as Governor Hoffman sits uncomfortably on the ostensible seat of power. The photo of Tweed on the right gives us some idea of his actual appearance in order to gauge the degree of Nast's caricature of him, emphasizing his girth to suggest his appetite and elongating his nose and characteristically smirking arrogantly. We see this characterization persist and even grow more exaggerated throughout Nast's campaign against Tweed and the Tammany Ring. In this rogues gallery on the left, this rogues gallery of Tammany operatives, Nast sarcastically presents them as the President of the United States and his cabinet of the next election cycle. Tweed's underlings, Sweeney, Hall, Connolly, Fisk, and Ingersoll, were frequent targets of Nast, and his suggestion that they'll ascend to national roles is a clear warning. Nast's identification of Hoffman as president is likewise a sardonic wisecrack, given that the rotund figure of Tweed is at the center. And if we look closely, we'll detect that Tweed casts a shadow in the form of Hoffman, with Hoffman's characteristic drooping mustache. These caricatures are consistent with a primary definition that art historians Ernst Kriss and E.H. Gombrich put forth. Quote, portraits which show the features of the subject in comic distortion without losing the resemblance, unquote. Still, in their book Caricatura, Kriss and Gombrich highlight how caricature can also function with minimal detail, as in this perhaps most frequently reproduced Nast cartoon. After months of having portrayed the obese Tweed as the poster boy of Tammany corruption in elaborate detail, this simple image relies only on Tweed's corpulence with a cash bag as a head, the brains as embezzled funds, veering away from Nast's typical approach of complex depictions of scenes, often with extensive textual supplements. Indeed, this particular cartoon resonates with a complaint attributed to Tweed himself, who said, "I don't care a straw for your newspaper articles. My constituents don't know how to read, but they can't help seeing those damned pictures." This complaint points to one of the challenges that Nast's usual complex style confronts. If popular humor is associated with the masses, as Greenhill suggests, and if those masses have minimal or no literacy, then Nast's sophisticated approach to satire, with its detailed panels, classical Roman imagery, and literary allusions to Shakespeare, Bunyan, Dickens, Defoe, Swift, and many others, risks missing its target. But as Tweed's annoyance suggests, Nast's use of caricature was still a clear enough focus of the cartoons to hit their target. Noting the long history of caricature, again, Kriss and Gombrich credit an emerging sophistication in this otherwise marginal art form to the Bolognese Renaissance artist Annibale Carracci, whose experiments in caricature arose not in opposition to classical art, but from within it. And I suggest that we can see many of the same qualities and strategies in Nast's caricature, which he no doubt arrived at independently. His artistic training gave his imagery a precision and fidelity to his depiction of events and people, but his willingness to take representational liberties and indulge grotesque exaggerations of his satiric targets reprised the effects that Carracci and his successors in the 17th and 18th centuries achieved. Another device that Carracci deployed was animal imagery, and here again Nast used it similarly to his advantage. In addition to popularizing the donkey mascot of the Democratic Party and launching the elephant mascot of the Republican Party, he also portrayed the rapaciousness of Tammany in the figure of a tiger. Here, as in the earlier cartoon of Johnson as a Roman dictator, the Colosseum is the setting for the death of Columbia, the classical personification of the nation, in the claws and jaws of the vicious Tammany tiger. In the gallery above, beyond the scene of carnage, just above the tiger, we can make out the corpulent image of Tweed looking on like a satisfied Caesar. The focal point of the image is direct and the critique unmistakable. Left unchecked, Tammany corruption will devour the nation and its virtue. Other animal imagery is more playful in caricaturing Tweed and his associates as vultures. At the time of this cartoon, Tweed and others had suggested that the whiff of scandal emanating from their various schemes would, quote, blow over, unquote, and it's referenced in the title of the cartoon and followed by the pun between prey and prey. So when Nast's campaign did help to topple Tweed, as he depicted here, Nast reprised the Roman emperor motif, figuring the Tammany leader a la Nero. Of course, the legal saga of Tweed's arrest, release, conviction, incarceration, escape to Spain, and final apprehension added more episodes to the story. This particular image is said to have led to his capture by the Spanish policia because the officers recognized him from the cartoon, which they read or misread literally as accusing Tweed of child abduction. Nast would continue to chronicle the political aftermath, taking on political figures, mostly Democrats, like Samuel Tilden and Benjamin Butler, and even some Republicans like Horace Greeley and James Blaine, until his career with Harper's ended in the late 1880s. Nast's harnessing of the tension between the elite call for artistic sophistication and the popular embrace of irreverent humor was not always a matter of punching up, however. A clear-eyed assessment of Nast's satire must acknowledge that he was just as likely to use caricature to denigrate immigrants, indigenous people, and blacks as he was to attack corrupt politicians. Despite his Republican support for the end of slavery and the extension of suffrage to freedmen, he clearly harbored the prejudices of the dominant culture, and much of his critique of Democrats was fueled by their outreach to Irish immigrants. Many of his cartoons traffic in stereotypical imagery, such as these. Although this cartoon criticizes the Chinese Exclusion Acts and depicts a Native American explaining to the Chinese man that white insecurities drive their oppression of racial minorities, the imagery of the two figures stereotype them both in dress, physiognomy, and in speech. The caption reads, "Red gentleman tells the yellow gentleman, pale-face 'fraid you crowd him out like he did me." Despite the criticism of xenophobic and xenocidal practices, the characterizations themselves are prejudicial and demeaning. This offensive image equates the purported ignorance of blacks in the South and Irish in the North as dual threats to progress, leaving really very little to the imagination. And in this last image, Nast disparages black legislators during Reconstruction in a manner that strikingly anticipates by 45 years one of the more offensive and thoroughly untrustworthy scenes in D.W. Griffith's grotesque characterization of the South Carolina legislature in his notoriously racist epic film, Birth of a Nation. Where Nast's most famous cartoons use caricature to depict specific high-profile figures, in these and others like them, he uses caricature to generalize an entire race or ethnicity in ways that debase all of that group. As distasteful and even dishonest as these images are, their effect is indicative of caricature, a word derived from the Italian verb caricare, meaning to charge or overcharge, to load up, to attack, and to exaggerate or embellish. Thus, the technique is an effective engine of visual satire, using grotesque distortion of appearance to charge its targets of viciousness of any kind, and therefore connoting the target's essence. Still, what distinguishes the best of Nast's work is how he situated caricature into a complex, contextualizing scene, using allusions to cultural and historical reference points and detailing the entire frame around the focal image, and thus bridging the high culture, low culture divide. Thank you.